Hi, my name is Dave Dixon, and I'm the featured speaker here tonight at the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee. It's a beautiful facility, and I'm really happy to be here. And I'm the author of 2 books. My subject tonight is Radical Warrior, August Willis's journey from German revolutionary to Union general. I'm also the author of this book, The Lost Gettysburg Address, Charles Anderson's Civil War Odyssey. You can buy both of these books on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or any of your local retailers. All right, well, thank you very much, Frank, and thank you all for coming and having me back here. Thank you also for scheduling me in October instead of January this time. For someone like myself who lives in California, that's always nice. So, I know you had Eric Wittenberg here. He's a friend of mine last time. And I once had the pleasure of introducing Eric at a conference out in California. And so I was going through and giving a little bit about his background, and I said, and Eric Wittenberg has published 26 books on the Civil War. And Eric stood up and said, Dave, that is 32. So if you ever introduce Eric Wittenberg, who's a very fine attorney, you need to make sure you really stick to the details. So some of you are familiar with my work. I really focus on biography, and specifically biography of obscure characters who have compelling stories, and August Willis certainly fits that bill. But I think biography can do a lot more. I think biography can offer us an intimate window into aspects of the Civil War that actually go beyond the bullets and the battlefield. So today, what I'd like to do is challenge you to think differently about one of the defining events in American history. So at 10 a.m. on April 7th, 1862, a brigade of Union soldiers from the Army of the Ohio rushed aboard the steamer John J. Roe at Savannah, Tennessee. They steamed upriver, then floated across and docked at a place called Pittsburgh Landing. As they disembarked, General Ulysses S. Grant asked one regiment, the 32nd Indiana Infantry, to detach from their brigade and march immediately to the battlefield. And as they began their march, the regiment's brass band struck up their favorite tune to get them excited for battle. And the men sang at the top of their voices to this song, and please raise your hand once you can identify the title of this song. Let's hope it works. Oh, otherwise I'm going to have to hum it for you. We'll let it play just a little bit, not the whole thing. It's a pretty stirring anthem. Okay, so many of you recognize this as La Marseillaise, the French national anthem. So why are U.S. soldiers marching into battle singing the French national anthem? Why not the battle cry of freedom, or God Save the Union, or any one of 900 patriotic songs that were composed in the North during the Civil War? And perhaps even more confusing, this regiment, the 32nd Indiana Infantry, was composed almost entirely of German immigrants. Now, how did the Germans and French feel about each other in the middle of the 19th century? Anyone remember Napoleon? The Franco-Prussian War? So when we read the English translation of these lyrics, it gets a little more puzzling. The typical Union soldier was not fighting tyranny or fearing that foreign invaders were about to murder his wife and children. Now, this stanza makes a little more sense at first glance, but wait a minute. This is early April 1862. The vast majority of Union soldiers have little interest in freeing the slaves. They are fighting to preserve the federal union. And who are these kings that want to enslave them? No, to really understand why German American Union soldiers are singing a French anthem and railing against the tyranny of kings and slavery, we may want to change the way we've traditionally looked at the American Civil War. This was not merely a sectional dispute pitting Northern brother against Southern brother over strictly American issues. We need to adopt a more expansive global view of the bloodiest conflict of the 19th century world. Now, a number of terrific historians have been studying the American Civil War through a global lens recently. These are two of my personal favorites. So I used the work of Don Doyle, Andre Flesch, among others, for context of my study of one particular German-American Civil War figure. So today, I'd like to make three arguments. First, that the American Civil War was part of a radical revolution focused on democratic government, workers' rights, and human freedom. This revolution was international in scope and unprecedented in world history. Secondly, that recent immigrants in general, and German immigrants in particular, played a decisive role in the ultimate success of the Union Army. And finally, radical 48er leaders like August Willich helped transform a war to preserve the federal union into nothing less than social revolution. A revolution that was even more radical than the revolution of 1776. Now, when we talk about radicals and their revolutions in the 18th century, one man stands head and shoulders above the rest in terms of influence. Thomas Paine's classic Common Sense, which was published in 1776, sold more than 100,000 copies. This remains the largest selling book in American history relative to population. So Paine inspired the American founders to pursue independence rather than simply a redress of their grievances against the English crown. He also claimed that this conflict was about human rights and social justice. And here's what he said. The cause of America is, in great measure, the cause of all mankind. He went on, quote, "My country is the world, and my religion is to do good." Now, the American Revolution that Paine helped inspire was certainly radical from a political perspective. The displacement of a hereditary monarch being replaced by a democratic republic was nothing less than transformational. But it stopped well short of the ideals of equality and social justice that were envisioned by Paine and promised in the Declaration of Independence. So the American Revolution may have been a political earthquake, but it left social relations in the new nation virtually unchanged. And the theme of a political revolution, conceived and executed by political elites like Washington, was reflected in the international leaders that supported the Patriot cause. So these three foreign generals were aristocrats, and they were fighting for political freedom, not social re-engineering. So Thomas Paine ends up at France, and the French radicals waste little time in imitating the success of their American allies. They initiated a sweeping social revolution, but they really overreached in trying to adopt the most radical aims of Enlightenment philosophers. They believed that perfect equality was the natural order of things, and they ought to impose it on the entire populace, whether they were ready for it or not. So these romantic dreams of a new social order soon devolved into a macabre nightmare. The American Revolution, on the other hand, had more limited aims. It had been carefully planned and carried through with a conventional army. The French Revolution, in contrast, relied on incohesive gangs of rioters. And of course, the result was chaos and terror. The French Republic soon disintegrated as popular general Napoleon Bonaparte consolidated his power and became Emperor of France. And the dreams of French revolutionary leaders were abandoned for the time being. The first half of the 19th century witnessed the beginnings of a dramatic shift from a society of rural farmers and artisans to a workforce that was increasingly factory-based. So instead of controlling one's own labor and production, capitalists now controlled most industries, and workers were paid in wages. Periodic harvest failures and the reluctance of rulers to consider liberal reforms increased the pressures on the kings and princes of Europe. And an outgrowth of French revolutionary socialism that was dubbed communism was gaining support among middle-class intellectuals. Tensions between liberal reformers and conservative elites finally came to a head in the watershed year 1848, where, as you might expect, all the trouble began in Paris. So it was a windy, gray morning in February, and thousands of unemployed Parisians assembled on the Place de Madeleine. They were soon joined by 700 students who crossed the Seine singing, thank you. Before long, street fighting ensued. Barricades were erected, and 2 days later, King Louis Philippe abdicated. And the rebels took turns sitting on his throne. One scrawled this message: "The people of Paris to all of Europe, liberty, equality, and fraternity." Then they took the chair to the Bastille and they burned it. And out of those ashes rose the Second French Republic. Now, despite the fact that there was no internet, no Twitter, news of this revolt spread like wildfire. And you can see everywhere where there's a star marks a revolt in Western Europe in 1848. So after some initial success, they were all crushed by reactionary forces and royal rule reinstated. France was the last to submit when Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew crowned himself emperor. Shortly before these uprisings, Auguste von Willich renounced his nobility and resigned from a 17-year career in the Prussian army. And he became one of the key leaders in the revolutions in southwest Germany, primarily in Baden and southern Rhineland, before taking refuge in Switzerland, France, London, and finally in America. In the face of so many of these failed democratic revolts, these political refugees were seeking a place where they could live out their principles of free popular government and then eventually return to Europe and reignite the revolution. Now, the America where most of these dissidents settled was hardly the fulfillment of the French Revolution's promise of liberty, equality, and brotherhood. America was indeed a free country, and it offered opportunities that were largely absent in Europe, but it was just as socially stratified as the old country. An aristocracy of wealth took the place of royal privilege. A large established base of American-born nativists resented this flood tide of European immigration. And of course, a huge permanent underclass of black enslaved people were treated more like farm animals. Once political refugees like Willich realized that hopes for further revolution in Europe had evaporated, most of them committed themselves to try to create a more perfect republic here in America. Like many of his fellow 48ers, Willich edited a German-language newspaper in Cincinnati. This was the first daily labor paper in American history. In his opening editorial, Willich vowed to, quote, support those reforms that are supposed to make this republic a truth for everyone. Besides his tireless efforts to promote trade unions and trade associations, Willich also formed alliances with local black leaders. And this caused him considerable trouble and even put his life in jeopardy when he led a multiracial torchlight procession to protest the execution of John Brown. He developed an original idea to transform the United States into a workers' republic. His proposal would replace the Congress with a national trade assembly, thereby eliminating political parties and moving the country closer to its founding ideals, a true social republic, as he called it. It was at best a naive and perhaps novel concept, but at worst, a radical and dangerous idea in the eyes of most conservatives. Willich welcomed the coming of the American Civil War, not to preserve the Union, but to create a social revolution that would defeat the slave-holding aristocracy in the southern states, preserve democracy and republican government, and secure the triumph of free labor. He hoped that this in turn would lead to better working conditions and perhaps a revision of the relationship between labor and capital. In this new future, Willich dreamed that worker exploitation of all kinds would end and that what he called wage slavery would be replaced by a more fair value for value exchange. Now, exiled radicals from all over the Western world supported the Union war effort. Russia, Cuba, and Spain were represented, along with 140,000 Irish immigrants who looked to Thomas More as their hero. Immigrants from Norway and other Scandinavian countries had their own ethnic regiments, like the 15th Wisconsin of Willich's own brigade. Hungarians and Canadians fought for the Union. Prussian revolutionary Karl Schurz, who was an early resident of Milwaukee, became the most accomplished German American probably in history after fighting alongside Willich in Baden. And if you look at the numbers, the impact of immigrants and blacks combined on Union victory is indisputable. Together, they represented the majority of federal soldiers who served in the Union Army. And foreign-born soldiers alone accounted for 25% of the Union Army's manpower, despite the fact that they represented only 13% of the male population. Immigrants from the German states particularly from the southwest where most of these armed rebellions took place, numbered more than 200,000. And many joined regiments that were either predominantly or exclusively German-speaking. And they shared certain characteristics that made them unusually successful soldiers. So firstly, they were about 2 years older on average than their native-born counterparts. Many of them came from Turner societies. These were German social clubs that emphasized rigorous physical fitness and military-style drilling. A large number in the officer ranks had actually had combat experience in those European revolutions. This was something that their native-born counterparts from the farm almost totally lacked. And they were also urban-based. So they had resistance to disease, much more so than the country recruit. And so they were much healthier in camp. Many were either strongly anti-slavery or full-fledged abolitionists like Willich. They were highly motivated to finish what they had started in Europe. For Willich and other recent immigrants, 1861 was 1848 all over again. It involved, in his words, quote, the same rights of men against a combined conspiracy of a traitorous slave aristocracy with the same powers of the old world. The Germans were also anxious to prove that they belonged here as Americans in the midst of virulent and even violent anti-immigrant sentiment. So Willich personally recruited 4 companies, mostly out of the Cincinnati area, and served in the all-German 9th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. But by the summer of 1861, he was awarded his own command. And here we see Willich on the horse here in the front. This man in the center, Henry von Treppe, his lieutenant colonel, actually fought against him in the revolutions of 1848. And this man on the right, Carl Schmidt, was his aide in the 48 revolutions and his adjutant in the 32nd. Willich's men called him Papa, and he referred to them as my little children or my fellow citizens. So for a long time, Willich resisted the idea of having a chaplain. And when one was appointed for him, that reverend lasted 6 weeks. So Willich himself conducted graveside services, often ending by stressing that theirs was not a conflict over nationality, but a war that was in the interests of all humanity. So it's not my purpose here to give you a blow-by-blow description of everything that Willich did in 1848 or in the American Civil War. I actually have 10 chapters and 8 maps in this book that do a pretty good job of that. But for a little flavor of just what kind of commander this man was, let's return to the battlefield at Shiloh, where we last left Willich and his men singing the French Revolutionary Anthem. So they arrive on the Stacy Field, where Willich is supposed to be held in reserve. He immediately requests and was granted permission to make a bayonet charge. Before they moved, Willich addressed his troops. Little children, today decides the fate of America. Then a shell burst overhead. If we are beaten today, everything is lost. Let us do our duty as a free man does. So Willich made 5 successive charges, changing front 9 times in the process. And despite this display of technical agility, his troops got really excited. They overran their support on both their flanks. So Willich halted them, rode around to the front of his column, and with his back to the enemy, drilled them in the manual of arms to try to calm them. He repeated this feat 18 months later at Chickamauga, and Lew Wallace later described it as the most audacious act of bravery he had seen in the entire war. The New York Times penned an extraordinary tribute to the general upon his death, calling him, quote, undoubtedly the ablest and bravest officer of German descent engaged in the War of Rebellion. In an immediate sense, however, Willich really failed in two of the three great causes of his life. He and his fellow revolutionaries did not overthrow the princes and monarchs of Europe, nor did they create a unified German Democratic Republic. His unceasing efforts to transform America into a workers' republic, where the workers controlled the means of production and received full value for their labor, never gained serious traction. His efforts to recruit and lead immigrant volunteers did help defeat the slaveholding aristocracy in the Confederate States, but this vision that Willich and Lincoln shared of a more perfect Republican nation was a lofty goal that would probably take generations to accomplish. No, by 1865, it was the radicals who had won the American Civil War. This precious but fragile republic that Washington had created had not been defeated. That result would have delighted the princes of Europe. Rather, popular government proved viable and resilient. It would take many years, but eventually much of Europe would follow America's example and either abolish the monarchy or make it purely ceremonial. The largest slaveholding empire in the world vanished almost overnight, and with it, $3.5 billion in lost property. For perspective, that was more than the combined value of all U.S. manufacturing and railroads combined. It's $105 billion in today's dollars. So talk about radical economic change. Equally significant is the idea that America would have to transition to a free labor economy virtually overnight. And although many radicals like Willich foresaw improved conditions for workers, it really didn't work out that way. The Civil War basically stalled the labor union movement, and it took decades for these unions to regain their pre-war momentum. The most radical outcome of the American Civil War, however, was the transformation of chattel slaves into American citizens. And this held the most promise for epic change. And for a time, the entire racial hierarchy in the southern states was turned upside down, with black men serving in Congress, while many white political elites were stripped of the franchise. But as you know, radical Reconstruction ended in conservative reaction, and we are still trying to erase the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow here 150 years later. Historian Eric Foner writes, quote, "The enduring challenge for radicals is they must be willing to fight and lose for a long time before even achieving partial success. So military men like Willich came from the well-educated German middle class, but they grew to resent aristocratic dominance. They also resented these forces of rapid industrialization that robbed working people of their independence and their dignity, and threatened to consign them, potentially, to a permanent underclass. Their commitment to change and their frustration with intractable rulers pushed them into radicalism and rebellion. And the reddest of the red, as Village was called by both his friends and foe alike, clung stubbornly to radical prescriptions and violent means even after such measures had failed. So rather than give up on his cherished democratic and socialist principles, Village and other rebel leaders emigrated from Germany in the hopes that they would find a warmer reception for their ideas here across the ocean. Now, this export of German revolutionaries and their ideology made some sense. After all, radicals throughout Europe had been working in concert for a Republican vision that transcended national borders. And the multicultural United States of America seemed a perfect place to continue that struggle. So Village changed his tactics from system overthrow to extensive reform through existing legislative channels. And he positioned the German-American sacrifice in the Civil War as an international human rights crusade, during frequent speeches to his troops. After the war, the general advised Union veterans to remain vigilant in the wake of victory, and he urged them to support democratic revolutions in the Old World. And here's what he said. "No temporary peace will undo the revelations of the times. Soon the voice of the people will be heard claiming the rights of men." Then Village urged his listeners to, quote, "wave the American banner of human liberty above the storm as a pilot light for the struggling nations." Pioneering German sociologist Max Weber once wrote, "What is possible would have never been achieved if people had not reached for the impossible." So 19th century proposals like an 8-hour workday, unemployment benefits, child labor laws, all once maligned as radical assaults on American institutions in the 19th century, became mainstream public policy in the 20th century. And activists like Village, who promote such far-reaching reform, may be forced to wait decades or even centuries for favorable conditions to emerge. And most of these extreme ideas, of course, never come to fruition. So circumstance and environment forced Village to adjust his tactics at times, but his core principles never changed. In fact, they formed a prism through which he viewed everything, including the American Civil War. And here's what he said to a fellow German-American Union officer, who also lived in Milwaukee, by the way, in 1862. "Encouraging and promoting a solution to the social question is and will remain the only task of my life. This work alone not only makes life more challenging for me, but in my view, gives it value." And I apologize for the subtle COVID reference here, which my wife pointed out when she saw this for the first time in Davenport, Iowa. So I may have to change the slide, but we'll go with it today. So what are the larger lessons that we can learn from the radical nature of the American Civil War? Well, first of all, such revolutionary social, political, and economic change usually happens incrementally over long periods of time. But radical actors can often provide an emotional spark that, given the right timing and circumstances, can create a tipping point event. And I think John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry is one such tipping point event. So Brown's extreme actions made it easier for radical secessionists to convince their fellow Southerners that Lincoln's election was yet another such existential threat. The failed democratic revolutions of 1848 actually provided rationale for radicals on both sides of the secession question. As I've argued, these radical 48er revolutionaries were a key part of Lincoln's core constituency and one of many reasons he was able to transform a war to save the constitutional union into a moral crusade for universal human rights and free labor. On the other hand, the idea that the people ought to be able to choose their own form of government, in other words, popular sovereignty, this was used by Southern radicals to justify their breakaway slaveholding republic. So I believe that this helps explain why at critical moments in history, such as the American Civil War, radicals from opposing sides of a crisis are able to exert influence and even accelerate events, despite the fact that most of the population holds moderate or even conservative views. So the sectional crisis in the United States is just one example of a pattern that keeps repeating when issues of global importance reach their tipping points. In the 18th and 19th centuries, political crises took center stage with the American and French revolutions, the revolts of 1848, and the American Civil War. All of these laid the groundwork for the eventual crumbling of monarchy and the erection of the new modern nation state. In the 20th century, ethnic nationalism and economic crises brought other radicals to the fore. Communists like Lenin, Stalin, and Mao co-opted and perverted the theories of philosophers like Karl Marx and created repressive, authoritarian regimes that were in some ways the antithesis of Marx's original ideas. Radical fascists like Hitler converted ethnic pride into murderous ethnic cleansing. And radical presidents like Franklin Delano Roosevelt used the Great Depression as a rationale for his New Deal legislation, which included dozens of initiatives that were described as socialist by his rivals. But of course, by the end of the 20th century, we had Social Security, unemployment insurance, Medicare, huge public utilities, all now bedrocks of a social safety net that would have been unthinkable to most Americans in the 19th century. Here in the 21st century, crises like pollution, terrorism, climate change, world hunger, and substance abuse top the list of global concerns. And radicals on all sides of these important issues are jockeying for position as their ability to influence the masses has been amplified by technology and social media. At some unknown point in the future, these pressing and universal issues, like those that prompted the American Civil War, will reach their tipping point. And when they do, we can expect that radicals will emerge from the fringes of society and become well-known names throughout the world. We can only hope that they have studied history and understand that they have a responsibility to act in the interest of all humankind to create positive and lasting change. Thank you very much. This is the ubiquitous commercial for the book, but I do really want to answer questions about this controversial topic and this unusual man. So, do you want to do questions? Yes. Yes, sir.
There's been a lot of times that I heard about 1848 and the rebel. I think I'm loud enough to discuss the fact that, PBS maybe last year had a great program on England in the 1800s and how the common people lived. And you could understand why Karl Marx and Engels wrote what they did, because the common people were being dominated by 1 to 5%. Now, if we're not careful in this country, fight in the Kaiser's War, and they landed in Baltimore, got off the ship, and of course, as we know, in the Civil War, you could buy yourself out of the draft. And a gentleman approached him with, I don't know, $200 or $300 gold pieces. Would you take my place in my draft? He said, I just left the Kaiser's War, I'm not going to fight in your war. So, 10 days later, they signed Anthem.
Yeah.
If you didn't take that money, you've been semi-rich already. The question I have for you is, the Germans at that time, you hear them talking, they have no idea what English, they have no idea what Constitution, they just came for land. Or people at Texas now, why Germans would go to Texas because the topography is not like the German topography to raise crops. My question is, why would German people want to fight in the South against the North? What is the relationship of Germans in the South and Germans in the North, why they fought on one side or the other?
Sure, sure. And I think before I answer the Germans in the South versus North question, I think it's important to point out that what I'm presenting here, of course, in talking about are radical leaders, and particularly radical 48er leaders that fought in those revolutions. I don't want to give the mistaken impression that the average German common soldiers was necessarily fighting as abolitionists or as political radicals. Most of these many Germans that came over for economic reasons. But this core group of 48ers who were political refugees were extremely influential. As you heard, Willich himself raises 4 companies just like that. So when the call came, and the Germans much earlier than the Irish, let's say, the German leaders, who many of whom were like Willich, were very influential in signing up these men. So, but to answer your questions about, and in fact, I published a piece on emerging civil war maybe about 6 months ago on one of the German communities in Texas, and that's primarily where you see a lot of the Union supporters in Germany. So it would be a mistake to say that the Germans were universally abolitionists, but it probably would not be a mistake to say that the German Americans as a group were predominantly anti-slavery. And so what you have in this group in Texas and the Hill Country in particular, near San Antonio, is you have a lot of Germans who are coming over. They're artisans, they're goldsmiths, they're highly educated people, and they're repelled by slavery, many of them. And here they are in Texas in the midst of it, right? So there was quite a bit of violence, of Texas Unionists, violence against Texas Unionists, I should say. So there were some Germans, obviously, who held slaves in the South. There's an exception to every rule, right? There were Germans that fought for the Confederate Army, but not in large numbers. So you're right. I mean, there were many Germans that had to flee Texas, for example, to get away from the Confederates, and they either went to Mexico or they went south to Brownsville and caught a steamer and got the heck out of Dodge. So it was a really good observation. The Germans were repelled by slavery as a group, mostly. Yes, sir.
Are you aware of any of the men who served under General Bush returned to their communities and became leaders espousing the ideas of the general? Because they were sort of lectured by the general as they were serving others.
That's a great question, and I must say that I have not followed some of the officers. I know some people that could probably give me really intelligent answers to that question. I can't give you an intelligent answer because I didn't spend a lot of time following the careers of Willich's various company captains, let's say, in all the. I will tell you that when he became a brigadier general, of course, he retained the 32nd Indiana, which was an all-German regiment. He picked up the 15th Wisconsin, right, Hans Hegg's old regiment, after Hegg was killed at Chickamauga. All 3 or 4 of Hegg's regiments were incorporated into Willich's brigade. But I really haven't, it's a great area of inquiry to see what kind of influence those political speeches had on, it's an excellent question, and I have not looked into it, so I appreciate that. Yes, sir.
If Village were alive today, what would he say about today's American society?
Oh boy, is that a loaded question. Well, I mean, who would he have voted for in 16? Yeah, I probably would have voted for Bernie, don't you think? Yeah, I think so. Well, I mean, I think as someone mentioned, as you mentioned, sir, earlier, I mean, there are a lot of parallels, right? We can see in the inequalities of wealth now are, if you look at the statistics, are just as great as they were then. So I mean, I kind of go out on a limb and say that I think Village would probably be pretty disappointed in what's happened with the relationship between the workers and, say, the corporate elites, if you will. I think he would be very much distressed that the labor movement did not go further in moving the country closer to at least his vision of a more equitable society. I feel quite certain he would be pretty disappointed that that didn't happen, or hasn't happened yet. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, I was struck by your description of the general in the context of his leadership, which suggests to me that he had an attitude of an aristocrat, royalty almost, and some even suggestion, connotation of godliness in the sense that he dismisses the chaplain and assumes that role himself, so that his, I don't know how to describe it exactly, but a sense of condescending superiority in his attitude and presentation, certainly to its troops, and that's a bit off-putting and doesn't square really with his actions geared toward social justice, so to speak, with the common man.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I would say that even though he was raised as a in the minor nobility, if you will, he really wasn't an aristocrat. I don't think that's coming from his aristocratic leanings. He was actually very much against the aristocracy. It's coming from his animus against organized religion in a big way. So you could say, was he a free thinker? Was he an atheist? He was somewhere on that spectrum, right? So he despised organized religions of all kinds, and Catholicism in particular, and felt that he felt that the Irish, for example, were being duped by their religion and were practicing all of these superstitious rites when they really should be thinking for themselves and coming to their own conclusions. So I think the dismissal, I'm quite certain that the dismissal of the chaplain has to do with his disdain for organized religion and not so much of a God complex. So that's where I come out on that. Yes, sir.
I'm not looking for detail, but my ancestry, which were 48ers that came over, would not wear any brass buttons, would not vote. They were farmers, and they stayed away from that. From my knowledge, none of them served in the war. But they stayed, 90,000 and 200,000. Was that typical, or were they really the minority that didn't want anything to do with the government?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm really getting the essence of your question. So I would say that the vast majority of the German immigrant soldiers that signed up, these 200,000 that you mentioned, were, to your point, not terribly political, right? So again, you have, and if you read Pete Carmichael's new book, for example, on the common soldier, there's a lot of research being done on the common soldier. So you don't want to confuse, like I said before, the leaders with the followers. I mean, there were still a lot of German immigrants who remained Democrats, for example, politically, and did not convert to the Republican Party when it started up in the 1850s. So again, these leaders exerted a tremendous amount of influence. So if it wasn't trying to follow, say, Villish's politics or not being aligned with his views on social justice, it very well, in many cases, is aligned with that need to prove themselves that they belong in America, because nativism was rampant in the 1850s. It was terrible. I mean, in Cincinnati alone, there were many riots where German immigrants were attacked. And to be fair, German immigrants, and especially the leaders, these immigrants were much more better educated than, say, again, I make the comparison with the Irish, right? See, the Irish coming over were primarily, like my ancestors, they were primarily living in sod huts in Ireland, right? They were laborers, they were tenant farmers. These Germans that came over, many of them were well educated. Germany had the German states, there was no Germany, of course, but the German states had the highest literacy rate in Europe at this time by far, much more than France. Their literacy rate was something in the 70s, and Russia, for example, was like 7%. So these were highly educated people, very different from say, some of the other immigrants. And it's also a very complex phenomenon to try to analyze why people fought. I mean, that's a very complicated question, and it really does come down to individuals and their particular beliefs and their situation.
I have a question
Okay.
for you.
All right.
On your musical selection.
Yes.
Did you, correct me if I'm wrong, sound a lot like Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean, a candidate for our national anthem?
Is it? I don't know. I'm not familiar with the tune. I mean, I've heard the name of the tune, but I'm not as familiar with the tune. So you could think Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean, ripped off La Marseillaise?
I don't believe they had copyright in those days. Columbia, Gem of the Ocean is one of the nominees for the Star Spangled, for the national anthem in
Right.
the 30s.
Yeah.
Sounds awfully familiar.
Yeah. Well,
I would have lost the contest.
yeah, and I mean, today there would have been a lawsuit, right? Yeah. So, other questions about this unusual man? All right. Well, thanks so much. I'll turn it back over to Frank, and I'll be at the table. Oh.
Well, David, I do thank you for your presentation and present you the certificate of honor by order of the General Staff of the Civil War Roundtable of Milwaukee. This award is presented to David Dixon for furthering our understanding of the causes and consequences of the American Civil War, the watershed event in our nation's history.
Thank you very much, Frank. Appreciate that.